the University of Aberdeen. So my research looks into early medieval hill forts of Scotland, but more specifically the nuclear fort type. So how I've kind of laid out this presentation is we'll just have kind of a brief introduction and like background. Then I'll go through the main questions that I'm trying to answer for my PhD. But for this, I'm going to focus more on the excavations that have been happening with the Northern Picts and the comparative kingship project. So I'm going to go through a lot very briefly in 20 minutes. So if you have any questions or want more information at any point, just let me know. So just briefly, early medieval Scotland is roughly 300 AD to 900 AD. We have numerous groups at this point. We have the Picts in northern Scotland, Dalriada in western Scotland, and then a mix of Brittonic Northumbrian people in southern Scotland. At this time, not just in Scotland, but early medieval Europe, we have this increase in social stratification and rulership, specifically increase of over-kingship with kind of more steps being added to this hierarchical ladder in a way. And we also see a return to fortified settlement in Scotland. So briefly, just hill fort overview. These are one of the most common archaeological structures in Europe, specifically Britain and Ireland. There's over 1,600 hill forts in Scotland alone. Multiple functions to these sites, defensive, ceremonial, the list goes on. Construction of them roughly began late Bronze Age, 1000 BC to 800 BC, but the majority of them are from the Iron Age, specifically in this intensive construction period between 400 and 200 BC. However, in Scotland, we see evidence of a reemergence of hill forts in the early medieval period, with some Iron Age forts being reused after long periods of abandonment or just purely new constructions. So when we talk about early medieval fortifications in Scotland, there's these three major types that we see. There's the ring forts, duns, and palisade enclosures like Rhynie, and then the coastal promontory forts like Burghead. But the type that I focus my research on is the nuclear fort. This was first defined by R.B.K Stevenson in 1949 when he surveyed the fort of Dalmahoy Hill just outside of Edinburgh. He defined these sites as consisting of a small central citadel enclosure on the summit with looping descending enclosures, creating this hierarchical organization of space. He said that these sites are found on isolated craggy rocky outcrops, isolated ridges and rocky promontories as well. And lots of them use the natural features of the outcrop in the defense and wall construction. Stevenson suggested that these were purely early medieval forts. However, excavation since the 80s has proven this to be wrong. Some are Iron Age, some are Iron Age and early medieval, and some are just early medieval. But since Stevenson, there hasn't been too much critique of the definition. Feachem added a subcategory called the Citadel Fort in the 50s, and then A.E. Truckle added another subcategory in Dumfries and Galloway called the Courtyard Fort. But it wasn't until Leslie Alcock in the 80s that we first able to examine these forts through excavation with sites like Dundurn, Dumbarton Rock, Denali Castle. He was the first to create these first absolute dates for this site type, and most of the dates were coming out to the 6th, 7th, 8th century AD, a time of the rise of central places that we see in early medieval Europe. And he was the first to kind of look past this structural morphology idea and look more at the hill itself and the natural morphology and how that would lend itself to the builders of the fort. And he also proposed that these small duns with outworks in Western Scotland fit this same concept, just at a smaller scale. So before I get into my stuff, Dunadd and Dundurn, these are the two famous site type of this. They're both mentioned in the Annals of Ulster, historical records of it. Both have been excavated, very similar assemblages, metalworking. Dunadd has one of the most extensive metalworking assemblages in northern Britain. Molds, crucibles, possible gold, silver work. But the big thing is the ewer and glass that was found at these sites. These are continental wares from the Mediterranean and Gaul. 6th, 7th, 8th century, we see this new trade network coming in through Western Scotland, coming through the Atlantic into Western Scotland. Both of these sites have been excavated, early medieval dates, mostly 7th, 8th century AD, but Dunadd has a smaller Iron Age phase as well. So we see this large abandonment period in between. And then we have possible feasting, high status feasting at some of these sites, like Denali Castle, Kingsea, and Burghead. We see this young cattle and pig, which suggests these are like the prime cuts of meat and kind of suggests high status. So here's just a map of all the forts that at least I know of that are semi-reliably dated to the early medieval period. So there's only really 33 that we know of at this point, compared to Ireland, where we have hundreds, if not thousands, of these sites that are early medieval. Again, most of the work has been done in Pictland, so we definitely need more work done in Western Scotland and Southern Scotland. And this number has basically doubled in the last 5 or 10 years due to lots of recent work by Northern Picts, Comparative Kingship, and other companies as well. So into the main questions of my PhD, I'll just list them off quick and then go through them. 1, are the nuclear typology and its variations useful? 2, where were the regional elite centers of early medieval Scotland? 3, what can archaeology tell us about the date and development of these sites? 4, can keyhole excavations help understand phasing? 5, can it help determine function of these sites? And 6, the major question of my PhD is, can a general model for identifying early medieval fortified sites be developed? So into the first question, are the nuclear typology and its variations useful? In ways, so I went through all 1,600 hill forts in Scotland probably a dozen times over the past few years, kind of nitpicking for specific attributes or smaller sets of data that seem to be coming out as early medieval forts. I ended up with 120 overall. I did this using the Atlas of Hill Forts of Britain and Ireland, Canmore, Royal Commission inventories, and even antiquarian stuff. So I looked for more than these specific attributes, but these are the kind of the main 5. So a small citadel central enclosure, usually less than 0.1 hectare, even less in Western Scotland. Isolated outcrop ridges and rocky promontories, like Stevenson said. Complex structural morphologies, again, not the most important part, it seems, but it's still, the more complex morphology is, the more likely there's multiple phases happening at these sites. Landscape prominence as well. Lots of these sites seem to be very visible and mostly the biggest striking locale in the local landscape. And also these natural and artificial terracing. So some of these sites, again, so for example, Dunsinane in the Highlands, this would never be considered a nuclear fort because it's just one giant stone wall that goes around the summit of the hill. But if you've been to the site, there's numerous outcrops that create this kind of natural hierarchy within the site. So it kind of does the same exact kind of thing. So I also did photogrammetry as well on about half of these sites. I'm not going to talk too much about it today. But again, this is just helpful for more accurate planning, mapping these terraces, looking at this natural morphology. And I think about half of the sites I've looked at have had unrecorded enclosing elements. So it's just more helpful to understand what's really going on. So 2, where are the regional elite centers of early medieval Scotland? So these are all the sites mapped onto Scotland. And there seems to be some clusters found along major waterways and routeways. One of the big ones is in the Murray Firth, kind of in the Murray Firth down Loch Ness into the Great Glen. This is probably for true the epicenter of the Picts. And then we have this kind of southern boundary zone with Fife and Perth between the Picts and Brittonic Anglo-Saxon people. There's another high density in the Kilmartin Glen Dunadd region. Again, this is just in general, that area is a very rich prehistoric landscape. Southwest Scotland, Dumfries and Galloway, we see lots of this courtyard fort, this like the subtype courtyard fort. And then we have another cluster in the Scottish borders. And all these, I found an example of all these sites in most areas of Scotland except the northern and western Isles. So this is just one example of one of these clusters. So this is the Murray Firth, and as you can see, 5, well, the EM means early medieval. 5 of them have already been dated to the early medieval period. And this is interesting in itself because they kind of hug the side of Loch Ness down the Great Glen. And this was likely a significant trading network in the 6th, 7th, 8th century coming up from Dalriada into Pictland. So 2, again, I made landscape maps for each fort. I'm still kind of analyzing these at the moment. This was looking for site clusters, so kind of the central place complex. So simply central place complex is if you're looking for a central place or a royal landscape of some sort, it's not going to come as an isolated site, but you'll get groupings of different sites. So you'll get a church and a fort and a cemetery or barrows or symbol stones or something along those lines. And in Pictland, we have some kind of, looking at some of the maps, there seems to be connections with symbol stones and square barrows, lots of at least invisibility and intervisibility models. Western Scotland, we see the same kind of connection with cross slabs and church sites, again, with the visibility, intervisibility. But again, I'm still kind of going through these and can't really talk about them too much at the moment. So into the big part, the excavations. So we've done keyhole excavations at 6 sites so far, with possibly one more planned. We've kind of picked different sites, pinpointing different characteristics of what we've seen in past dated early medieval forts, and see if we can find more of them. So Mither Tap of Benny, I believe Gordon presented about this a few years ago at this conference, but this is one of these sites that's always been suggested to be nuclear or early medieval due to its morphology. It's also one of these sites that extensively uses these terraces and rock outcrops within the fort, creating all of these smaller spaces within. This is only one of 2 examples in Aberdeenshire of this site type, and it has possible connections maybe with the people of Kay, of one of the proposed Pictish kingdoms. Before our excavations, there was a watching brief in 2006 where they had 2 radiocarbon dates from the mid-7th to the late 8th century AD, and then the mid-4th to the mid-6th century AD. Our excavations found evidence of metalworking. We found a crucible, a small crucible at the wall face of the lower citadel. This has been suggested to be used for precious metals like silver and gold. We also found large quantities of young cattle and pig bone, again, suggesting high stays feasting, possibly at this site. Radiocarbon dates, again, we got 7th century AD from the upper citadel and 8th century AD from the lower citadel. Again, this 6th, 7th, 8th century kind of the rise of the central place kind of idea in Europe. Another one we dug was Craigrock in Fife. This was just identified as a fort in 2007. It was never discussed as being early medieval until my master's dissertation, which I also did on these kinds of sites. This one was found more so by looking at the wider landscape. It's quite a rich landscape in the Largo area around Largo Law. There's the London Links Pictish Cemetery. There's a few symbol stones, and Norrie's Law Hoard is not too far away from it as well. And again, if you look at the site, it looks similar to what you see at Dunadd and Dundurn. But here we found lots of evidence of metalworking in the upper citadel. We had a blacksmith chisel, crucible, molds, 2-year fragments, slag as well. And we found lots of evidence of feasting, again, this young cattle and pig in the upper citadel. And we received 2 radiocarbon dates back from the citadel in the mid-7th century AD. And there's future work planned on trying to get to some of the lower enclosing elements in July. Here's just a few photos from the excavation. That's the blacksmith chisel, or the proposed blacksmith chisel in the trench. We found a burnt timber with a peg still in situ in one of the structures that we possibly found within, and a whole sheep skull in the wall collapse that just completely deteriorated once we took it out of the ground. We also excavated recently Dunmore and Fife. This is again comparable to Craigrock, found not too far away from Craigrock as well. Possibly part of this emulation replication that we see the sites sometimes, kind of replicating different things like that. This was previously excavated by Dr. Oliver O'Grady, who said he had possible evidence from the 1st to 7th century AD. He found evidence of slag, metalworking. We did as well in the trench that we put in the upper citadel. And outside the central enclosure, we found large intact timber planks, about 5 or 6 of them, that burned in situ, suggesting some kind of burning event in the citadel. We just finished kind of floating the samples, so the radiocarbon dates are going to take a few months to get back. We also dug Craig Dorney in Aberdeenshire. This is the other one of these 2 in Aberdeen. Again, this is one that was picked because it's a rocky outcrop and it's really prominent in the landscape and has lots of these small natural terraces within. We placed 3 trenches in the interior on some of the terraces. We didn't get too much datable material. However, we did hit a possible hearth on the upper terrace and received a date back from the mid-5th to late 6th century AD. Again, this is another site that there's future work planned, hopefully in the next few months, to look at more of the enclosing elements of the site. We also dug Norman's Law in Fife. This is the largest fort in Fife. You said to be 6.5, but looking at it in our ArcGIS, there seems to be a possible unrecorded enclosing element below it, making it up to 9 hectares in size. It's comparable to East Lomond Hill and Clatchard Crag, which are both known Pictish early medieval forts. And this was a good case study to pinpoint some of these attributes because one, it has the nuclear structural morphology, but it's much larger than what we're usually looking at. And we placed 3 trenches in the upper citadel, one of the lower terraces, and then another lower terrace. And again, didn't get much datable material, but ended with a single Iron Age date between, I think it was 100 BC to 100 AD region. This could be partially flaws of the keyhole excavation. Again, one date for a 9-hectare site is not going to be able to determine the whole story of the site. And again, with lots of these sites that we've been digging, we aren't really touching the interior elements as well. So we're not getting the whole story, but it's just helping us understand a little bit about what's going on at the site. And then this week, which we just finished yesterday, Dunsinane Hill in Perthshire. This is possibly Dunsinane in the Pictish regionalists and was excavated by James Playfair and Nairn. The excavation reports are really difficult to interpret. Not really sure what was going on. There was a possible burial chamber within the interior of the fort where they found possibly 4 bodies. But we dug on some of the ramparts in the upper citadel and found intact layers beneath where Playfair and Nairn excavated, and were able to get some charcoal to date. And we also dug one of the lower terraces where there's a roundhouse that abuts the outer rampart, and found intact floor deposits, which we will be able to date as well, and found a small little mortar that has been suggested to be used for kind of crushing up special pigments of some sort. Radiocarbon dates will be determined because we just finished yesterday. So in question 5, can archaeology help determine the function of these sites? Yes and no. These are likely high status sites. Again, things like e-ware, we didn't get that in any of the case studies that we did, but again, this is a flaw with keyhole excavation, not getting too much of the interior of the site. Metalworking, we had the metalworking evidence in Mither Tap, Craig Rock, and Dunmore. Feasting, again, Mither Tap, Craig Rock had that. Lots of these sites are very prominent in the landscape. Like, look at sites like Mither Tap. It's definitely the most striking locale in the local landscape. Lots of these sites are too small for the larger populations. This is a difference that we see from the Iron Age to the early medieval, this kind of othering aspect of space, less people inside, more people outside, in this kind of stratified society that's increasing in the 6th, 7th, 8th century. However, we have excavation bias. We're missing common settlement. 1, we always choose to dig these kind of nice sites like this, and 2, we're just really lacking in the archaeological record the kind of everyday person settlement record. Some of these sites have this abandonment and reuse. Again, none of the case studies I've done have shown this, but we have sites like Craig Fadrig, Platcher Crag, Trussey's Hill, and Dunadd that show this 700, 800 year gap of use. This could likely have something to do with the rise of Christianity again in the 6th, 7th, 8th century as a way of controlling the local population through going back to prehistoric monuments. We see the reuse of these things is quite common in the post-Roman world. Barrows and stone circles and things like this have been reused in the early medieval period. Lots of these sites also have an elaborate procession to the citadel, like places like Dunadd and Dundurn. Again, Craig Rock, some of the case studies. You have to basically make a full circle around the site to get to the citadel. This could be a display of wealth and power. The clustering of sites that I was suggesting, showed on the map earlier, may suggest like central places. Again, this time with central places. There's comparable sites found in Wales, Northern England, and Ireland, but they're very rare. This seems to be more of a Scottish phenomenon that's happening with these kind of smaller nucleated sites. So finally, can a general model for identifying early medieval sites be developed? I believe yes, to an extent. Again, out of the 4 sites we've excavated, 3 of them have come back with 6th, 7th, 8th century dates. There's obviously differences between some of these Iron Age and early medieval forts. Size is one most of the time. Location, lots of the early medieval forts seem to move towards the coast or to major waterways, likely to take advantage of the trade networks, crossing places and controlling what's coming in and out of the local landscape. The citadel-like enclosures on the summits seem to be a defining symbol of this as well. Small, natural, artificial terraces using all available space. The prominent isolated rocky outcrop that Stevenson has suggested seems to be a site of choice as well. But again, it's hard to define all hillforts by this one strict definition. And that's been part of the problem with the nuclear definition to begin with. So in conclusion, the results are still a work in progress. Still have a lot to do with some things, but the possibly the end of the word nuclear. It's quite of a rigid definition. There needs to be a better way of looking at these sites, looking at smaller sets of data, and instead of focusing on the enclosing elements as much, focus more kind of on the hill itself and the landscape around it. We need more work outside Pickland, again, Western Scotland, Southern Scotland, and again, more attention to the wider landscape. And like everything, more excavation, but again, that's costs money, so it's kind of difficult to do a ton of it. So yeah, that's me, thanks.